Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show, we're concentrating again on landlords and estate owners and some interesting anecdotal stories about our land estate owners in County Clare and the origins of their names and bits and pieces and so on. Now, our show airs out from Radio Corkabashkin in beautiful Kilkee, and we'll be concentrating quite a bit on estates and landed gentry and so on for the next while, because it's such a clue as to what's happening on the ground with the changeover in lands and so on. So for the Gore family, and this is what we're discussing today, there is an amount of branches in County Clare and in Mayo, and also as the Earls of Arran. And one of the things to keep in mind is that although they would have had their estates in the counties, they frequently in the directories have their addresses in Dublin addresses around Kildare Street and so on. So they do keep a city house, and they do, or whether they're in clubs or lodgings, they very much follow the trend of the English aristocracy as well. Now, one of the things, though, about the Gores is that they have a fascinating military history. They have a lot of records in relation to their owning of dogs and bits and pieces, but we're just going to briefly look at their surname, first of all, the origin of it. So the Gore surname, meaning history and origin, was found at an early date in Kent and Wiltshire, and that was the origin of the surname Gore. The word itself is derived from the Old English gara, meaning triangular piece of land, and it's a derivation of gar, meaning spear, describing the triangular shape of the spearhead. On the site we looked at, we found many family connections for the US Gore ancestry, and also we have the famous Al Gore, of course. In England, the early records of the surname were Alan Athay Gore in Essex in 1273 and William de Gara in Wiltshire in 1274. The surname is particularly well recorded in the church registers of Wiltshire and Kent from the mid-16th century onwards. The Gara place name was to be found in Wiltshire in the Domesday Book and the Gore Cross near West Lavington, and that dates from earlier times. So the Gores of Alderton in northern Wiltshire first made their appearance with William Gore around the 14th century, with a later William Gore acquiring the manor of Alderton in 1382. The antiquarian Thomas Gore, a descendant of this line, wrote the family history in 1666. So anyone with interest in the Gore ancestry might find that very interesting as well. So the Gore family of London and Ireland can be traced back to Wiltshire, and how they came into Ireland in the 16th century is quite significant as well. In 1602, Paul Gore arrived in Ireland as a captain of a troop of horse. There he married a niece of the Strafford family, and in 1622 was made a baronet at Manor Gore in Donegal. The main lines from him went as follows. So went to his eldest son Ralph, and he became a Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1733. They were ennobled as the Earls of Ross in 1770. Their direct line died out. The next line, Arthur, in 1662, became a baronet in Newtown in County Mayo. And remember, baronets are new titles as such. A lot of baronets are made in the 17th century. His great-grandson and namesake was elevated to the peerage as the Earl of Arran in 1762. They built Beleek Castle in 1830 and were large landowners in County Mayo during the 19th century. Another line, the Ormsby Gores in the early 1800s, became the Baron Harlechs. A younger son, Francis, did not become a baronet in his lifetime, and they became the Booth Gores of Arterman in Sligo. The line became known as the Gore-Booth baronets, and they made their home at Lissadell House. This was a house of so much splendour before its decline after World War I. Two books, Dermot James, The Gore Boots of Lissadell, and Sonia Tiernan's 2012 book, Eva Gore Booth, traced their family history. Now, we have some boots going out as part of the Jamestown settlers in 1607. And what we're concentrating on today is the County Clare Gores, who we have a general, very famous general around the Derrymore estate in County Clare, and we have some fascinating history about him, where there wasn't much in the sources that we were looking at. So we went and we would have explored petty court sessions, landed estates, encumbered estates, wills, and so on. He was born around 1860 and he died in 1912. And we know when he died because of his will, but we also know when he died because of his unusual form of burial. So can you tell us a little bit about the unusual form of burial where he was buried in County Clare, and a little bit about him?
Yes, he was in Africa in the Boer War, and he was leading his horse in a jungle area, and he was somewhere, he got knocked, and he was attacked by a boa constrictor, the largest snake in Africa, roughly, he said after, about 17 to 18 foot long. And the horse came to his aid, and with his front legs he reared up and attacked the snake and drove him off and saved General Gore. General Gore then, he was finished with the war in Africa, he was coming home, so he bought his horse from the English army and brought the horse home in the ship with him, kept the horse in his farm, his estate in Derrymore, and when the horse died, he'd been buried above in the field, one of his fields, and he had a metal or iron frame put around the horse's grave, and it was a good bit bigger than the horse's grave. So one of the workmen there said to him, "Why have you made this area so big?" And he said, "I'm going to be buried with my horse who saved my life." And when he got older and died, he was buried with the horse. And his wife, she lived some few years after him, and she said, "I'm going to be buried with my husband and his horse." So they're buried in that farm all the time, in that place which is fenced off by an iron railing around it.
Very interesting. And it's unusual even at that time that they wouldn't have been buried in the Protestant church, perhaps in Tulla, because it's in the Protestant church records on the Clare Library website that I could verify that indeed he was interred in the Derrymore estate as part of his estate. And when we were looking for the petty court sessions, we found that he owned 6 dogs in one of the accounts. He had 4 terriers, 1 spaniel, and another unusual pointers as well, and also a coach dog. So it's on. I will have to do a little bit of research into what a coach dog is, but so we're not sure about that. And those wonderful records of the dog licenses often give the names of dogs, so we must give a look. He had 4 dogs. He was a man who kept a lot of dogs, but of course he did not like any trespass on his estate and would be very upset if people were setting rabbits or anything like that. And we find that we have 2 cases, one with the Bolans on Boland's Hill in Annachneil, and another with the Ballinahinch Walshes, where they have to come to a strict written undertaking not to trespass on the lands again. They are not fined, however, and he seemed to be a well-liked man. There is a House of Commons Parliament where he's refusing police protection in a time of great trouble in Ireland, and he's saying, I'm perfectly safe and I don't need that type of protection at all. So his son Reginald, actually, one of the things about him is that he marries one of the Talbots, and there's a famous divorce case brought in front of the House of Commons in 1916. And people might think, well, you know, why is a divorce case? But divorce is rare enough, you know, in this time, and it's not, it's frowned upon. And often in the case of aristocracy, it has to be bought in front of the House of Commons because of the lineage issues that there are there. So that's somewhere where you find sources as well if you're doing up family histories and you know there are cases like this for your family and so on. So Derrymore Estate, I'm not sure how many thousand acres it was, but I do know that you have to be careful with the Gore family if you're doing some of the research, because some of the Gores branch around Drumcliff take on the Hickman surname, and they're expected to take on the Hickman surname if they want to inherit the Hickman lands. Now, this is quite a common enough occurrence, and it doesn't have to be amongst aristocracy, where people will take on the surname of the person, or they'll be left land because they are of that surname. Have you heard of people gaining lands because they were, for example, of the same surname, but they weren't really a strong relation? I would have, yes, where they wanted to keep the name on the lands. So people would have left it to a distant cousin because they were surnamed Hogan or Maloney and so on, to keep the lands within the same surname. I have heard that happen quite a good bit. Yes, exactly. So you would have that kind of lineage, the pride in the name being all sorts as such. So the Gores are interesting in the fact that we have a nice load of branches of them that go to Australia, they go to Massachusetts, in America, and they're in Massachusetts. They went from Southampton, it's thought, in 1638, and their homestead was inhabited by the Gores until 1878. Now we have the Virginia Gores, we have the Maryland Gores, we have Australia and New Zealand, with William Gore arriving from Ireland in 1806 to fill the post of Provost Marshal in New South Wales. He was subject to ongoing problems of debt and penal confinement throughout most of his 40 years in the colony, though. So this is a very interesting surname, and but when you're researching it, it's quite difficult to get some sources on it, especially with the Irish branches. So you would be well off to go back to your genealogy sources of looking at Griffith's valuation. I looked, for example, for the 1901 and 1911 census, and I couldn't find them on that. So they may be in England, or they may be in 1901. The Boer War is still on, I believe. So where would he be? He would be out fighting the Boer War, where he had fallen with his horse, and he bought 2 horses over, didn't he, back with him?
Yes, one horse died on the ship coming back, and he said after the horse was thrown overboard when he was dead, and they saw this big white shark snapped him in two when he hit the water.
Well, that must have been upsetting for him.
But the horse that saved him survived the journey.
And do we know his horse's name? We're not sure of his horse's name, which is a pity because we'd love to have that. But perhaps we might be able, it might be on the marker on the grave up in Derrynane, and we know that's privately owned now at the moment. But an interesting count. Now, interments on private lands were outlawed at a later stage. So it was your own business where you were buried up to this time. But this would have been the final interments on private lands in 1912. Private burials in things like that were would have been outlawed after that, not so long after that. And there was quite a lot of rules and regulations brought in burials, with that they had to be a certain depth and they had to be a certain size and so on. So burial has its own laws and regulations, and it does come in. There is a difference between a cemetery and a graveyard. A cemetery is an ordered type of arrangement, and it's very much from the 1850s onwards, very Victorian. And a graveyard, of course, goes back to hundreds and hundreds of years old, where you have them always situated beside a church. But you may find in a cemetery there is no church in the location of a cemetery. It doesn't have to be. But in the medieval graveyards, you have the smaller churches and that and the graveyards burying the outside of that. So very interesting accounts as such. So what we looked at was the petty court sessions, which were very interesting. We would have seen whether the case was dismissed. We looked at the dog license registers, where you paid a license fee for each of your dogs and so on. And you were fined if you didn't have a license for your dog. It could be quite onerous if you didn't do that. And we know that our Gore family in Derrymore had 6 dogs. So he had quite a lot of dogs, 2 bitches and 4 male dogs, pointers, coach dogs and terriers. So obviously he was a man given to hunting himself, and he didn't appreciate it if any of his neighbours in Ballynahinch or Annagneal were inclined to trespass or poach, and he would ensure that the full rigours of the law were put down on them. So hares and rabbits would have been much prized as a food source. And of course, we know in later times that the hares and rabbits were sold during the emergency years, to great money being made out of those during the war, the Second World War. So just to keep in mind that it's often in the context and the local little histories and the unusual events of what happens. And we had a very interesting story of the Gores, how they came in, their different branches today, and all that ties very much within the landed aristocracy of County Clare. And we're delighted to have brought the show to you. We will be concentrated on landlords and landed estates and so on. Last week we looked at some Tipperary landlords, and we'll be looking at some far more, the Vesey Fitzgeralds, the Hickmans, the Purdens, how the Gores would have got their leases. They controlled Tarida Castle for a while as well, and so on. So how this all fits into when the leases end, who's taking them up, and how the land transfer is happening. The Encumbered Estate Act records that we were looking at were as late as 1871, and we see the Gores taking over some of the lands, or the McMahons taking over the lands from the Gores, and it being divided amongst them still before we have our independence, and land is taken over by the Land Commission and distributed in that way at that time. So the 1926 census is going to tell us a lot about, it's going to be a very important census to give us what's happening with ownership and what's happening after 1911. And that extreme period of flux, with a lot of the landlords perhaps disappearing from the landscape yet again, just as they had done after the famine. So that's all for today, and thank you very much for listening. Our show is podcast out on a Sunday and repeated, so that's all for today.